So let us begin the study tonight. We are in the book of Nahum, and last time we covered the background as well as chapter 1. And Nahum is the name of the prophet God inspired to bring a prophecy against Nineveh, the great capital city of Assyria, which we've already covered in the book of Jonah. We saw that Jonah was sent to Nineveh and prophesied to them their destruction because of their sins, but they repented, so God relented from their destruction. And while Jonah focused on the prophet and less on the city, here we have a prophecy against the capital city, Nineveh, and really the Assyrians as a whole. And the time that this was written, around 663 to I think it could be, I don't know, 1/3. I don't know. We'll have to ask the experts, the Adams, Sonia. But this was written between 663 and 612 BC. And so one important thing to note is that Israel, the northern 10 tribes, had fallen, had been taken into captivity at the hands of Assyria. And God promises to bring justice against the Assyrians. Well, God had said, I would send Assyria, the rod of my anger, to punish Israel. They did so in incredibly brutal fashion, as they did with other nations. And so God will go through and say, because you were so brutal, and on the other things, He'll go through and say, you will be treated very harshly as well. And so God promises to bring justice, as we went through the first chapter, and He promises to provide for those who continue to trust in Him. We saw this very clearly as we went through that there are prophecies against the ancient capital and nation of Assyria and Nineveh, which were fulfilled in 612 BC with the fall of Nineveh, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. And we also saw that there were dualities in prophecy, even through chapter 1, pointing to Assyrian power at the end of the age as part of the beast power. And so that will continue through chapter 2 and 3 as we look at, yes, the fulfillment leading up to and including the destruction in 612, but also some elements that are clearly pointing to a future time. And we'll make those distinctions as we go through. All in all, chapter 1, if we were to sum up, focused on God, His glory, His power, His greatness, His justice, because God is going to inspire Nahum to describe now in chapters 2 and 3 the destruction of Assyria. And God is taking this opportunity through the prophet Nahum to provide a message of encouragement to Judah, which is still a nation and yet sees the threat of this Assyrian power at their doorstep. And God is reminding His people to endure. No nation is greater than God. God sees all that's going on, and so God reminds in chapter 1, endure. A very fitting reminder for us as we ended last time, just think about what we're facing and will face in the coming years towards the end of the age. And so here in chapter 2 and 3, we'll cover chapter 2, which contains the judgment against Nineveh, as God pronounces judgment. And chapter 3 will describe the destruction that will take place and the reason why. So chapter 3 does talk about, well, the judgment that will come in the form of destruction. And then chapter 3 will describe why. What was it that Assyria did that led to their destruction being prophesied? So let's jump into Nahum chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. He who scatters has come up before your face. Man the fort, watch the road, strengthen your flanks, fortify your power mightily. For the Lord will restore the excellence of Jacob like the excellence of Israel. For the emptiers have emptied them out and ruined their vine branches. So this is connected to verse 15 of chapter 1, where God says that there's going to come peace. He's talking about the Judah continuing, enduring. And then he turns here as destruction because he says he is utterly cut off. Assyria will be cut off because he who scatters has come up before your face. And so this is really I wouldn't say sarcastic, but certainly tongue-in-cheek challenge from God to Nineveh, telling them to go ahead and try to prepare. So what's described there, manning the fort, watching the roads, strengthen your flanks, fortify your power mightily, these are all things that a city, an armed force would do to prepare for an invasion. The forts, remember, they had these massive towers along the wall, surrounding their whole wall, 250 feet high towers, 100 feet high walls. And so they're manning these forts. They're watching the roads where advancing armies would come. They're strengthening their flanks, their sides, so that their whole surrounding is protected, and fortifying their power. All physical preparations. And God says, go ahead and do that, but it will be of no use, because he who scatters is coming before your face. So God has pronounced that they will be scattered. The word for scatter literally means scatterer or dasher. If you take something and you smash it and you dash it to pieces. So God is saying, he who scatters has come up before your face. Now hold our place here. Let's notice in Revelation chapter 2. Who is it that dashes or scatters? Well, of course, when God has set a proclamation that a nation will be scattered or dashed, God does that. So here in Revelation chapter 2, notice in verse 26, it says, he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. This is something we look forward to as part of the first resurrection. The first fruits, the saints, will live and rule with Christ for 1,000 years, ruling over the nations. Revelation 20 describes that. And it says, speaking of Christ, he shall rule over them with a rod of iron, and the potter's vessel shall be broken to pieces, shattered, dashed, as I have received from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. So it's God who scatters and dashes, and God has set his face, as we'll see, against Nineveh. And so their destruction is coming regardless of their plans that they make. Regardless of the physical preparations, regardless of the mighty armies that they're going to form, God will cause it to come to pass by any means that he desires. Verse 2 it says, the Lord will restore the excellence of Jacob. Now, if you have a King James Version, you'll note that it says has. It's past tense. Well, it's translated in the, as I said, the King James, the Lord hath turned away the excellence of Jacob. Well, in the New King James, as well as many other translations, it is future. The verb is in the perfect sense in the future. It says the Lord will restore the excellence of Jacob like the excellence of Israel. What does it mean when God says he will restore or return the excellence? Well, the word that's used, hold on one second, I got to plug in my computer. There we go. Hopefully that worked. I just got a note on my computer saying the power was about to die, and I thought I had plugged it in. So sorry about that. But the verb here, when it says will turn away or will return, is the root word shub or shuv in the Hebrew, meaning to go back or do again, to reestablish or to bring back. And we've covered this many times throughout the prophets, the minor prophets, that God will bring back his people. But the way it's phrased is very important. So God is saying here that Nineveh, Assyria, had plundered Israel. That's very clear. He says, for the emptiers had emptied them, had emptied Israel, and ruined their vine, utterly razed them out, took them out of captivity, and yet God would restore them. He would bring them back. But he uses two different names to describe this process. First, he says he will return Jacob, reestablish Jacob, which means the very same Israelites that he rejected. Now, the difference in the naming is important, because when Jacob's name was changed to Israel, he changed from to become a covenant partner with God. And so when it says that he will take Jacob and return him, but this time it says he will restore the excellence of Jacob like the excellence of Israel. So the Israelites that he rejected, which have already been taken captive, he will this time in the future restore them to the majesty of Israel as the chosen covenant people. Now this again, has not happened yet. It's a future fulfillment that will come to be. Galatians chapter 6, look at a few verses. The restoration of Israel will come through not the physical promises that they once had, but the spiritual covenant of which you and I are partakers. Galatians 6 and verse 16. Galatians 6 and verse 16. Start in verse 15, says, "For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but a new creation." And so there was this conflict that existed all the way back from the very beginning of the church in Acts 2, and as God called Gentiles, well, what do we do with those who are uncircumcised, those who weren't from the nation of Israel or Judah? Well, ultimately, circumcision or uncircumcision doesn't avail anything but a new creation. That is a circumcision of the heart, as Romans 2 describes. So what identifies Israel, God's people? It says in verse 16, "As many as walk according to this rule, peace, mercy be upon them." Believing and being ruled by the good news, the gospel or scripture, who walk according to the words and laws of God, says peace and mercy upon them and upon the Israel of God. You and I are part of the Israel of God. Let's notice this in Romans chapter 11. We covered this a number of years ago. We went through the book of Romans, this very important distinction in prophecy that Paul was going through about his people, the Israelites, both the 10 tribes as well as the Jewish brethren who have been cut off. And yet they have a hope to come back, to be reestablished, as Nahum is talking about, not through their old promises, but through the new covenant. So Romans 11 and verse 11, talking about Israel, says, "I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles." So Israel was cut off, but not that they would fall forever. It opened now the doors for the Gentiles in verse 12. "Now if their fall is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentile, how much more their fullness?" So because Israel failed and the new covenant was promised, which the Gentiles could partake of, how much more will those Israelites who failed bring to fullness the promises once they have God's Spirit? Drop down to verse 23. It says, "And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again." He had offered Israel this wonderful promise of a relationship with God through the promises of Abraham, and they rejected it. And yet, if they, once they're resurrected and they choose to believe God and follow His laws, they will be grafted back in. "For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and grafted contrary to the nature into a good olive tree, how much more will these, who are the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree?" God will bring them back. They will no longer be Jacob, supplanter. They will be Israel, one who struggles with God. So there's some important theological understanding here. Nahum chapter 2 once again. But it's also clarity because God is telling Assyria to prepare for a restored Israel. Now, Israel was not restored in 612 when Nineveh fell and the Assyrian Empire collapsed. So we know these prophecies are for a future time, that there will be an end-time nation of Assyria at the center of the beast power that will take into captivity and kill modern Israel. and yet God will use his people to destroy this beast's power. So, very important distinction here as we go through. Let's go into verse 3. It says, "The shields of his mighty men are made red. The valiant men are in scarlet. The chariots come with flaming torches in the day of his preparation, and the spears are brandished. The chariots rage in the streets. They jostle one another in the broad roads. They seem like torches. They run like lightning." These verses describe a picture of war. Israel, or Assyria, which had been the emptiers, they had stripped nation after nation, including Israel, would now themselves be emptied. God would bring recompense upon them. And here we have this coming to be through this military power in verse 3 and 4, describing war, imagery with multiple fulfillments. It describes the shields of the armies assembled against Assyria as being made red. Well, the Medes and the Babylonians, which are the nations that came together to defeat Nineveh in 612, they had their shields that were red, made from copper, had a red hinge to them, and they painted them red as well. Sometimes with paint, other times with the blood of their enemies. But these nations are the ones that assembled with their red shields, wearing red scarlet clothing, and coming with their might and their war and their implements of war to destroy Nineveh. And so when they stormed the city, it was chaotic and they rained utter destruction. And so in the day of their preparation, as they're coming, we see talking about chariots raging in the street, jostling one another in the broad roads. When the city begins to fall and the walls are collapsed down and the armies are coming in, killing indiscriminately, it's such a chaotic scene. Desperation. And we also see perhaps some depictions here of future fulfillments. We're not sure what Nahum saw, but in verse 3, notice it says, "Their spears are brandished." In most translations, they'll have a little side note. Literally means the firs or the cypresses are shaken. And so it's describing some sort of massive concussive forces that are shaking the trees, the very foundation of the trees. Could be a depiction of something in the future. You see bombs going off and things that shake even massive trees, technology that wouldn't have been available at the time. It describes chariots running like lightning with flaming torches. Well, this certainly could be in the heat of battle. It's hyperbole. It seems like their chariots are moving this way. It's so quick, everything's happening so quickly that it's like moving like lightning. But it could be that Nahum was given glimpses of a future modern technology or even future technology that quick moving tanks or other implements that are destroying and causing chaos. We see that happen in the book of Revelation quite frequently in Revelation 9, which we'll turn to later. The implements of war are given descriptions like locusts and sounds as of beating hooves. And so describing some implements of war, we don't know what they're describing, but in terms that the Apostle John, and in this case Nahum, could understand. But what's clear is that it's depicting devastation, chaotic military invasion. Dropping down to verse 5. It says, "He remembers his nobles. They stumble in their walk. They make haste to her walls, and the defense is prepared. The gates of the rivers are opened, and the palace is dissolved. It is decreed, she shall be led away captive. She shall be brought up. Her maidservants shall lead with her as the voice of doves beating their breasts." So in some translations, he remembers their worthies or their nobles. As with most warfare, the nobles, those in authority, receive the greatest protection. You have a massive army, and it's the king and his advisors and all the nobles that are gathered behind all of that as protection. And so it describes them fleeing to their fortified positions. They make haste to the walls. The defenses are prepared to protect them. And we made note of the 100-foot high walls that were incredibly thick. Remember, the 3 chariots wide could ride across the walls. And there were 1,500 towers along the wall. each at a height of 200 feet, along with a moat surrounding the city, which was 20 miles long. So we find they're going to try to shut themselves up, to prepare the defenses, protect the people. Let's hold their place here, go to Revelation chapter 6. They're preparing for the fight by hiding, which is not, that's what most people do. When devastation is coming, they hide. This will be the same at the end of the age. Before the great day of God, the day of his wrath, the day of the Lord that comes through the trumpets and the bowl plagues, people then too will hide. Revelation 6 and verse 14, the heavenly signs, then the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place, and the kings of the earth, great men, rich men, commanders, the mighty men, every slave, every free man, hid themselves in the caves and the rocks and the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? So they too will hide, seek to be hidden, call for the rocks and the mountains and the caves to protect them from God's wrath. And they'll stumble. It will be great destruction that's going to be coming upon them. So in verse 6, it talks about the rivers that will open and the palace dissolved. If we remember in Nahum chapter 1 and verse 8, it described and prophesied a flood. It says in verse 8 of chapter 1, but with an overflowing flood, he will make an utter end of its place. I just wanted to quote here from a book called The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, by Mr. Will Durant. It says, quote, Sennacherib, who came against Judah in the days of Hezekiah, raised at Nineveh a royal mansion called the, quote, incomparable, surpassing in size all other palaces of antiquity. Through the reign of Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon, the palace had deteriorated so much that when the next emperor, Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian emperor, came to power, he extravagantly rebuilt it. So we have this palace that is built up prior to destruction, beginning in 700 or so BC into the late 600s BC, and then it fell into disrepair. And that great palace was destroyed when Nineveh was invaded in 612. And one of the main factors in that was there was a heavy amount of rain, as well as the Tigris River, which Nineveh was built upon, over-flooding its floodplain. And that played an integral role in the destruction of the palace and the city, allowing the armies to come. And so if a literal flood of water came and destroyed, as well as a metaphorical flood of an army, which we covered last time. In the same way, at the end time, the palace of the beast power will also be dissolved in a metaphorical sense. A literal sense, but the flood representing an army likely used at that time, but we don't know. Now in verse 7 it says, it is decreed, she shall be led away captive. Now the reason I read that is because some translations, including the King James, does not translate it is decreed, but it says hazab. Those of you who are reading the King James say, well, what is hazab or hazab? H-U-Z-Z-A-B, I think. H-U-Z-Z-A-B. And it's a very difficult word to translate. The reason the King James doesn't translate it is because there's a very distinct possibility this is referring to a name. Now this makes sense because it begins to immediately use a pronoun, in fact a feminine pronoun, hazab. She shall be led away captive. So it seems to be referring to an individual, perhaps a figurehead within Assyria. And so hazab, this is what Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown says about hazab, or hazab, the name of the queen of Nineveh. Like it could have been a real person, from a root implying that she stood by the king. So why some translations say it is decreed because it stands, it shall stand, a decree means something shall stand. Her name seems to be that she stood by the king, the queen. And we have this directed here at the queen of Nineveh. Now it's interesting that we have a female reference, because this is in all likelihood a reference to the quote harlot that will come up in the next chapter. As we go through chapter 3, we'll see that the harlotry beginning in verse 4 will come up. Harlotry being symbolic of paganism and false religion. This may be a reference to the queen who led the religious element within Nineveh. That seems to be the case, and we'll see that as we go through into chapter 3. It also could be inferred this is a reference to the great harlot in Revelation that will come on the scene. Let's hold our place, go to Revelation chapter 17. So in the same way, we have the king of Nineveh and Assyria, the political power. This harlot that's referenced, the harlotries, is an imagery that's also given at the end of the age to the religious power that works with the beast. So in Revelation chapter 17, really verses chapter 17 and 18 would be good to reread in connection. But let's begin reading in verse 4. It says, "The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, and the filthiness of her fornication," her harlotries. So literally these pagan, anti-godly worship practices that she practices and gets other nations to practice as well. And notice it says in verse 5, "Her forehead a name is written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement." So this false religious system and all of her offshoots, remember in Nahum it talked about Hazab and her maidservants being destroyed as well. In the same way, at the end of the age, this harlot, this woman representing a false religious system and all of her daughters, it says in verse 5, the mother of harlots, she is the mother, and there are offshoots of this religion that exist all over the world, will be destroyed as well, in the same way that God promised that through the prophet Nahum. Going back to Nahum, interesting connections here, but we got to continue to make time. So Nahum chapter 2 and verse 8 says, "Though Nineveh of old was like a pool of water, now they flee away. Halt, halt, they cry, but no one turns back. Take spoil of silver, take spoil of gold, there is no end of treasure, or wealth of every desirable prize. She is empty, desolate, and waste. The heart melts, and the knees shake. Much pain is on every side, and their faces are drained of color." So when destruction comes, God says, before Nineveh was very powerful and wealthy. And it was like a pool of water, meaning it's deep and rich, and when it goes, it's capable of lasting a long time and providing. But now the people are fleeing, despite their leaders calling them to stop. So you have this picture of a city that's being sieged and attacked, and rather than standing and fighting, the people are retreating. And you have the leaders and you have the nobles that are standing in their fortified positions saying, "Halt, stop, turn and fight." And nobody listens. They keep running away. And as a result, the city is left broken, desolate, and ready to be spoiled. And the invading army will come in and take the spoils there, all the treasures that they had stole from all the other nations Assyria had. The riches gained through all these means, and then they're left empty, desolate, and waste. a terrible time that comes upon them. They lived the high life. They had all these expensive things and treasures, and they had all these fortified positions and all these things that they were able to do, and yet when they're left desolate, their world was shattered. Hold their place, go to Joel chapter 2. We notice the description: the hearts melt, the knees shake, much pain, and their faces are drained of color. This is exactly a prophecy about the day of the Lord. And when the Babylon of the future resurrection of that government and religious structure come on the scene, there will be great wealth and power, which we'll talk about as we go through. But when God brings the destruction to them, people will melt. So it says in Joel chapter 2 and verse 6, notice that before them the people writhe in pain. All faces are drained of color. They run like mighty men. They climb the wall like men of war. Everyone marches in formation. They do not break ranks. The day of the Lord will result in the same fear. Where once there was power, a mighty nation, God brings a greater power to play. That's His power. Both with Nineveh in 6:12 and in the future. It will be God that will bring to nothing the beast's power. Back to Nahum chapter 2 and verse 11. Nahum 2 and verse 11 says, "Where is the dwelling of the lions, and the feeding places of the young lions, where the lion walked, the lioness and the lion's cub, and no one made them afraid?" A description here of Assyria, likened unto a lion, brutal, unrelenting. We accounted of that in some of the background, as well as the future fulfillment of the risen Assyrian Empire. In verse 12, the lion tore in pieces enough for his cubs, killed for his lionesses, filled his caves with prey and dens with flesh. So here we have this nation which was once feared among the other nations, would go around and feed and prey on nations surrounding them in brutal ways, spoiling them, filling its dens with flesh, its caves with prey. So bringing back those spoils back to the city of Nineveh, fortified by its walls, riches exceedingly great. In Revelation chapter 9 and verse 8, we mentioned we go to Revelation 9 and verse 8. There will be a fierce power that is called the beast power, a military might of which no one will be able to stand. In fact, we'll read that here in Revelation 13. Here's the beast, who can make war with her? Powerful, mighty. And we'll go around and do this same thing. Destroying, tearing into pieces, feeding those who are loyal. Revelation 9 and verse 8, notice it says they had breastplates like breastplates of iron. This is a massive military force that had given authority for 5 months to torment people. A description here of the beast's power, the military might. They had breastplates like iron, and the sound of their wings was like sound of chariots, and many horses running into battle. That's what I was looking for. Revelation chapter 9 and verse 8. Oh, in verse 8. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. There's description of these military implements, describing as well as a lion. That fierceness, that might will be stripped. As we read in verses 8 through 10 previously, God will take it all away. And people will ask, was this the nation that was so powerful, like lions going around consuming who they would, taking what they wanted for spoil and storing it, and becoming incredibly wealthy? Stay here in Revelation, go to Revelation 13. Assyria was one that was so powerful, people thought, who could stand up to this brutal nation? Who'd want to? And we'll read about some of the brutalities until we get to chapter 3, because they treated people in just grotesque ways. And at the end of the age, the same will be the case. Revelation 13 and verse 4 says, "So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?'" The dragon, Satan, is behind these powers. And yet the nations will say, who can make war with such a powerful nation, who's fierce like a lion? Verse 4 is a rhetorical question, where the people are saying, who can? And yet there's an answer. And the answer is given back in Nahum chapter 2 and verse 13. Every nation that has ever existed that rose to a pinnacle of power and had the same idea, what nation can fight against us? Look how powerful and mighty we are. They forget that there is one who always has more power. And so in verse 13 of Nahum 2, behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall be heard no more. God stood against them. God says, I am the power and the might that could stand up to any nation. And this nation in particular that did terrible things, God says, I'm going to put a stop to it. Hebrews 10 and verse 31 says it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. We also know Romans 8 verse 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? Yet if God is against you, who can be for you? You know, this is a comforting thing. God is always watching. And as I was putting together the study, you know, on a national level, we see a power is going to come on the scene called the beast power with the backing of Satan. And we'll talk about how that happens here in a little bit. And it's going to be some scary things that they're going to do, terrible things. And yet God says, it's only a matter of time before I destroy you, destroy all your military implements, destroy all the ravening warriors. And it says, cut off your prey from the earth. Those who are enslaved by this nation, which existed, will be set free. And the voice of the messengers will be heard no more. You know, this in Assyria, they had heralds. This happened in Judah. When Sennacherib came down, they sent out heralds to scare the people. And they came out before a siege city and said, just give up, or we'll kill you all. Well, God says they're going to be silenced. They're not going to be heard anymore because I'm going to utterly destroy you. I've set my face against you. Judgment will be executed. But the same true, we think about it in this large scale, but even on a small scale. So let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 5. Maybe a slight deviation in topic. We're talking about this large scale nation to nation and armies. And yet even on a personal level, you know, we could get really worked up about, well, this nation's doing evil and evil and evil. And yet God sees and witnesses, and He will cause vengeance to come, His judgment. In the same way, we may think in personal relations, well, this is a problem that really needs to be solved and needs to be taken care of, and we need to let God sort it out sometimes. So in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 24, some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but those of some men follow later. Likewise, the good works of some are clearly evident, and those that are otherwise cannot be hidden. You know, there are sometimes we see sins that are clearly evident, and people get their comeuppance, they get their punishment. Others are not. And God says it will follow later. In the same way, those who are doing good, sometimes people are doing good works, and it's clear. Boy, that's a really good example. Others people are doing good works behind the scene, and maybe others are saying bad things about them, and yet God says it won't be hidden. The truth will come out. That should be a great comfort. In the same way, in the national level, an international level, the terrible things that we see, God will address. Hidden or clearly evident, it will all eventually be addressed. So, in verse 13 in verse 13, God says, judgment is coming. It's going to be executed. The question then remains, why? He describes what will happen. He describes the judgment that will come. And then in chapter 3 and verse 1, he begins to say, why? Why will all these things befall the nation? Well, it begins in verse 1 by saying, woe to the bloody city. Woe, a warning. It says it is full of lies and robbery. Its victim never departs. The noise of the whip, the rattling of wheels, of galloping of horses, of clattering chariots, horsemen charged with bright sword and glittering spear. There's a multitude of slain, a great number of bodies, countless corpses. They stumble over the corpses. God details here, just in a brief selection, the lowlights of the reign of power of Nineveh. They were a bloody city, killers, murderers, filled with blood. But more than just killing. There's examples of that and warnings throughout Scripture about those who shed blood, innocent blood. But the Assyrians did more than just kill their enemies. Some graphic depictions of the historical accounts of Assyria, they were known for cutting off the body parts of their conquered people. Yes, beheading them, cutting off their head and killing them that way, but maiming. They would cut off hands, feet, even lips, ears. Just grotesque brutality, filling the whole city with blood on their hands, out of seemingly enjoyment. You can't practice that. They had a great power, and yet they used it in terrible ways. They were a city, as it says, filled with lies and robbery. Assyria was known for dealing deceptively in foreign affairs, breaking treaties, feigning to offer help to allies. And all of these things are bringing woe. They'll be killed without mercy because they showed mercy. The inhabitants of the city will be slain in an unlimited supply of seemingly countless corpses. Well, there's more. In verse 4, it says, because the multitude of harlotries of the seductive harlot, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nation through her harlotries and families through her sorceries. So God zeroes in now on their harlotries as part of the why. Known, as we mentioned before, occult, witchcraft, paganism filled the city and the empire. This was anciently the case and will also be the case for the future fulfillment. A clear reference to a system that will once again be prevalent at the end of the age. A religious movement paired with a political power, it says, selling entire nations. It says, who sells nations through her harlotries. Hold their place, go to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13, we'll begin reading in verse 11. Revelation 13 and verse 11 says, then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. Here, like a lamb, but speaking like a dragon, a false religious system as well, a false Christian figure. Jesus Christ is the lamb. But here is someone portraying to be a lamb, but really is from Satan, which pairs with Revelation 17, which we read, the harlot, this religious system. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in the presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Through her harlotries, causing idolatrous worship of the beast's power. From families to nations, through witchcraft and occult that's going to be integrated with this religious system. It says he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth. He deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. And he was granted to give power to breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So this describes a religious figure at the end of the age that comes from the harlot that we read in Revelation 17. They're synonymous. This has happened and occurred throughout the ages. In a series of revivals, the Roman Church has granted power to various dictators. Notice what we read. This religious figure says has authority and causes everyone to worship the political figure of the beast. A religious and political alliance Well, the Roman Church had granted power throughout the last 2,000 years to various dictators, violent men who ruled as holy Roman emperors. A whole selection of them going down throughout time. Justinian, Charlemagne, Otto the Great, Charles V, Napoleon, the Kaisers. 6 revivals of this. Let's go to Revelation 17. 6 times this has happened, and one is still ahead to come. Another time in which the Roman Church will give power and authority, working with this political power, with harlotries, sorceries, witchcraft, just like we're reading in Nahum. Revelation 17 and verse 9 says, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits," this harlot. So this harlot sits on the 7 mountains, the 7 hills of Rome, the Roman Church that's there, currently called the Catholic Church or Universal Church. It says there's also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. Mr. Michael Miles gave a sermon within the past year about this, and using this verse as the title. It's on the website. If you haven't listened to it, feel free to look into it. Notice it says, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is yet to come. Well, there is one yet to come at this time. And it says, the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7th, and is going to perdition. So there will be an end-time coalition of nations, and this beast power will come from that, the 7th revival of these kings, and they will give authority, as we'll see here, to one man. And so in verse 12, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind. They will give their power and authority to the beast. So 10 kings, a coalition of 10 nations, 10 kingdoms, will come together as one and give all their authority and power to one man, this beast power. And facilitated by and supported by this woman, this harlot, this religious figure. And so we have this will happen in the future. It's happened throughout the ages, but there was some element of that within Assyria and Nineveh. Going back to Nahum chapter 3 and verse 5. Nahum 3 and verse 5. God again says, "Behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness, and the kingdoms your shame. I will cast abominable filth upon you, make you vile, and make you a spectacle. It shall come to pass that all who look upon you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her? Where shall I seek comforters for you?" God says, I'm against you because of all these harlotries, because of your blood and lies and robbery and all these terrible things that they've done as a nation. Just brutal and terrible things. God says you will be shamed. This depiction of showing your nakedness as a show of shame, it's metaphorical, and they will be abandoned. No nations will come to save them or support them. They will become a spectacle. All the nations will watch and see the fall of Assyria and Nineveh. And no one will help. They'll all flee away. There will be no one there that will mourn her. And so at the end of the age, Babylon will fall as well. And it will be a similar shame and a spectacle to all the nations. Go back to, down to verse 8. Nahum 3 and verse 8, God says, Are you better than Nahum, that was situated by the river, that had the waters around her, whose rampart was the sea, whose wall was the sea? Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was boundless. Put and Libam were your helpers. God refers to Nahum. Nahum is also called Thebes, which is in Egypt. Thebes sat strategically on a great river, the mighty river Nile, and had also the sea there as a rampart. So it's hard to approach as a protectant, a wall there. How can you approach when you have the sea giving you protection? Thebes was the seat of many pharaohs. That's where many of the pharaohs made their headquarters. The major center of religious worship in Egypt had sprawling temples, massive amounts of temples that were filled with wealth, as well as what we've just read, harlotries and sorceries and all these pagan things. They were fortified, much like Nineveh, had 100 gates surrounding the city, even had allies. Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, Put and Libam. So the surrounding neighbors were actually allied with this city. And yet, no Ammon or Thebes fell. And what nation was the one that destroyed Thebes or no Ammon? It was the Assyrians. God here calls a piece of history. The Assyrians came and invaded Thebes in 663 BC. Sargon was the one that came down into Egypt, and as he destroyed the city, he left 27 miles of ruin in his wake, utter destruction. And so this would have been something within the Assyrian history they would have been aware of. They accomplished this. They had all similar things like Assyria, but they also had allies, nations that were there to help them. And God says, are you better than them? What happened to them? Well, in verse 10, God says what happens to them. Yet she was carried away. She went into captivity. Her young children were also dashed to pieces at the head of every street. They cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. Well, more brutalities of the Assyrian Empire. Children dashed to pieces. This often happened when a nation was committing genocide, wanted to wipe out complete bloodlines. Casting lots for honorable men, they're taking them into slavery, deciding who would get who. And they're bound and chained. All the weak were killed, and those who could serve a purpose were taken away for whatever they wanted. Children slaughtered, mighty ones taken captive. This is an example of a nation Assyria attacked and treated terribly. God uses them to highlight what will happen to them. Revelation chapter 18 and verse 14, holding our place. Revelation 18 and verse 14. When Babylon is destroyed, the future fulfillment of these verses, every nation, you could say the same thing. Are you better than the nation that came before? Well, the only way a nation will succeed if they put God first, and no nation has done that. Not truly, not in a way that leads to total peace and prosperity and God's blessing. Not until the millennial rule of Jesus Christ will you see this play out. Even Israel, that had God's laws at the root and core of their structure, failed. Revelation 18 and verse 14 describes here all the vast wealth of Babylon, and it says, the fruit of your soul and the fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more. The merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance for fear of her torment, weeping and wailing, saying, Alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple, scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing, and every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, and as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried. So at the end of the age, what made you better than the other nations? They will be destroyed, carried away. This is encouraging for us. One, God sees everything, which we've already covered, all the evil done, and God does not forget. This is all part of His plan. Back to Nahum chapter 11, Nahum chapter 3, and verse 11. Nahum 3 and verse 11. Some very profound parallels here. Nahum 3 and verse 11 says, You also will be drunk. You will be hidden. You will seek refuge from the enemy. All your strongholds are fig trees with ripened figs. If they are shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. Surely your people in your midst are women. The gates of your land are wide open for your enemies. Fire shall devour the bars of your gates. So God says, just as Thebes, no Ammon was carried away, you will be drunk. This literally happened. As the impending doom came, the people of the city decided to engage in drunkenness and sexual orgies, these massive parties that they were having. And so you'll try to seek refuge, but you won't find it. You'll all be drunk. You won't be able to stand and fight. Your strongholds will just be shaken, and all the plunder will fall into the hands of the enemy. This describes the destruction of Nineveh will be as easy as picking ripe figs. If you've ever, most plants, but even if you think of trees, when an apple, for instance, gets very ripe, the riper it gets, the easier it is to have it come off the tree. Sometimes it falls by itself. And then the same thing with figs. As the figs ripen and they get to a stage where they're so ripe, all you got to do is hit the tree and they fall out and they fall down. And so it's describing Nineveh, the city. It's like, well, they just come. It's not going to be hard for them. They'll look like this, and it'll fall right into their lap, and they'll be able to take it, all the plunder. The soldiers will be as drunk or as women. This is at the time women didn't fight. Soldiers were men, and certainly as physically superior. He said, your soldiers will not be able to fight the way that they should or need to. They will be inept, unable to avoid their utter destruction, just like they had done to many, many nations before. Then in verse 14, draw your water for the siege, fortify your strongholds, go into the clay, tread the mortar, make strong the brick kiln. So he says, similar, just like in chapter 2, go ahead and try to prepare for this. Bring in water ready for a siege. Go ahead and fortify your strongholds, build up the brick, all the weak places, make it really strong. You're not going to be able to withstand it. He says, there the fire will devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will eat you up like locusts. Make yourself many like the locusts. Make yourself many like swarming locusts. It says, fire is going to destroy you no matter what you do. Interesting note for historically, the king, when the city was being stormed, actually killed himself. He did so by lighting himself on fire. And so he says, fire is going to devour you. He says, make yourself like many, like the locust. He says, go ahead and try to build up your army, get as many as you want, but it's not going to work. We take a step back. This prophecy was given, and we know there's no indication that it was read in Assyria, but it was read in Judah, excuse me. So Assyria was at this time still incredibly powerful. This is prior to their fall. They hadn't grown as weak as they would. And so he says, yeah, go ahead and continue to build your might. You have your army is like a swarm of locusts. They're growing and growing and continuing to trust in their power, but it's not going to save them when the day comes. And in verse 16, you have multiplied your merchants more than the stars of heaven. The locust plunders and flies away. Your commanders are like swarming locusts. Your captains are like grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges on a cold day. And when the sun rises, they flee away, and the place where they are is not known. So even though they had multiplied their abundance, I would write down, we don't have to go there now, but what we've referenced in Revelation 18, the abundance that will exist with the beast power, Babylon, at the end of the age, will be extraordinary. But it won't save them. You can have merchants on every port, and you can have vast wealth coming in, and they had tons of wealth coming in. Just like Assyria did anciently, they will one day in the future, and it won't save them. It will all fly away. They will be destroyed. Their leaders will abandon them. So it says your captains like great grasshoppers. Well, they're hiding out in the hedges. It's cold. And then when the sun comes out, they try to flee and get away. Mighty men will be unable to stand for what's coming. They'll flee away. Then in verse 18 and 19, as we close out, it says, your shepherds slumber, O King of Israel. Your nobles rest in the dust. Your people are scattered on the mountains, and no one gathers them. Your injury has no healing. Your wound is severe. All who hear news of you will clap their hands over you. For upon whom has not your wickedness passed continually? The leaders of this corrupt and terrible nation will sleep or die, be forgotten. No one will want them back because of how terrible they are. The people who are left will rejoice because this empire did so wickedly continually. They will clap. They will applaud the destruction because there was a nation that oppressed and lied and killed and maimed nation after nation. This will happen in Babylon. Revelation 18, verse 20 to 24 describes the destruction. Those who mourn are the ones who got wealthy off of Babylon, but all the other people were hurt and trampled by them. Revelation 18, verse 20 to 24 says, rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. It says those who are trust in God will rejoice at the destruction. It goes on to describe in verse 4, in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all who were slain on the earth. They'll be utterly destroyed and abandoned. In 612, Assyria fell, and this prophecy was fulfilled partially, but it remains as well for an ultimate conclusion in the future. God used the fall of Assyria as a type of what would befall the beast, the false prophet, and all those who stand against God at the end of the age. And the book of Nahum ends with that. Ending this book, we may think, well, yeah, that's not for us. Israel and Judah, when they heard these words, they may have thought similarly. When Judah, the people of Judah said, well, that's for Assyria, down with them. It's against Nineveh. Yet these words are meant directly for them and for us. First, as we saw, for an encouragement. In chapter 1, if we continue to place our trust in God, He will lift us up and protect us. Now that's a lesson for us to learn, and it's highlighted through what happened with Assyria. God says, look what happens to Assyria. They trust in merchants, they trust in their military might, they trust in all these things. Utter destruction. Trust in God to protect us. We get a glimpse of the corruption of power. What did Assyria do with their might that they had developed? They did terrible and horrendous things. They used it in a carnal, ungodly way. A lesson we should learn against as well. We're reminded, as we've covered before, the law of sowing and reaping. Whether it's individual sins or national sins, it will find us out. And finally, the last thing we'll cover, we need to be warned about ecumenicalism. It goes through it, and we read in Revelation 18, the first part there, as it goes through talk about this harlot and the Babylonian system, God says, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins. We need to be incredibly careful that we don't fall into the trap of adopting blended ideas and customs and religious practices. We should keep ourselves unspotted from the world. Clearly hold the line of the truth. There's going to be deception that's coming. There's going to be those who say, well, we're all in the same boat. We're all the same. Yeah, we have little different ideas here and there, but we're all going towards the same goal. That's not true. We hold fast to the truth. Not to get mixed up in the harlotries, idolatries, pagan worship and custom, making accommodations for those things. They have no place in our life. So that ends the book of Nahum. So a couple minutes over. Again, always hope that these are helpful. We will plan to continue these studies in 2 weeks. We'll go on to the book of Zephaniah. So we'll go into the first Z, Zephaniah, in 2 weeks. We'll cover background and get into chapter 1. A book about the day of the Lord in a very similar time as Nahum, but we'll cover the background at that time. So thanks for connecting tonight.